The Duke of Merston had a system. It was not a complicated system, but it was precise, and it had served him well for the better part of a decade. Staff were hired on the basis of references and competence. They were paid promptly and treated fairly. They performed their duties without excessive noise or sentiment, and when they failed to meet the standard required, they were let go not unkindly, but firmly, because kindness without firmness was simply delay. 3 governesses, 2 housekeepers, 1 secretary who had come highly recommended from a duke of considerably more patience than Merston possessed. None of them had lasted longer than 8 months. None of them, he was fairly certain, had lost sleep over their departure. The system worked. The household ran. His daughter was educated, clothed, and fed. That was the function of Thornfield House, and function was what Richard Merston understood. What he did not understand, what had been bothering him, in a low and persistent way, like a loose thread he couldn't locate, was Miss Clara Ashby. She had been at Thornfield for 3 weeks. She had not, as far as he could determine, done anything remarkable. She arrived on time to lessons. She submitted her weekly reports in clear, legible handwriting with no superfluous commentary. She did not seek him out. She did not make requests. She was, by every measurable standard, exactly what she was supposed to be. And yet, yesterday, passing through the corridor near the kitchen, he had heard laughter. Not Lily. Lily hadn't laughed in the better part of a year. The kitchen staff, all of them apparently at once, at something Miss Ashby had said that he hadn't caught. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. This morning, old Garrett the groundskeeper, a man who communicated primarily through grunts and had done so for 22 years, had left a small bunch of late-season dahlias outside the schoolroom door. An hour ago, Mrs. Howell, his housekeeper of 15 years, had referred to Miss Ashby as a breath of fresh air in a tone that suggested she was stating fact rather than opinion, and dared him to dispute it. He had not disputed it. He had nodded and returned to his study and sat at his desk and found, irritatingly, that he could not concentrate. He could not explain why this bothered him. He told himself it didn't. He was not convincing. She had arrived on a Tuesday, which Richard later thought was appropriate. Tuesdays being neither the optimism of Monday nor the relief of Friday, but simply a day that got on with it. He had not been there to receive her. He had been in his study with his estate manager going over drainage reports, which was where he was most mornings, and he had left Mrs. Howell to manage the introduction. This was entirely standard. He had not been present for the arrival of any governess. He saw no reason to adjust the practice. He met Miss Ashby for the first time at dinner that evening, or rather, he passed her in the corridor outside the dining room, where she was walking Lily back from the kitchen after what appeared to have been some kind of unauthorized biscuit expedition. Lily was holding a biscuit. Miss Ashby was holding Lily's hand and saying something in a low voice that made Lily look up at her with an expression Richard hadn't seen on his daughter's face in quite some time. Interest. Simple, uncomplicated interest. Miss Ashby looked up, saw him, and said, "Your Grace, I apologize. Lily was hungry before dinner, and I'm afraid I didn't discourage it firmly enough. It won't happen again." She said this without particular contrition and without particular defiance, simply as a statement of fact. He had looked at her properly for the first time. She was younger than he had expected from the references, perhaps 26, 27. Brown hair, simply arranged. A face that was pleasant rather than striking, the kind of face that didn't announce itself, that you might not remember immediately but found, on reflection, that you had noticed more than you realized. She met his gaze directly, which some people found difficult and she apparently did not. "See that it doesn't," he said, and continued to the dining room. He had not thought about it afterward. There was nothing to think about. By the end of the first week, the kitchen maid had begun saving the best of the morning rolls for the schoolroom breakfast tray. Richard learned this accidentally, when he mentioned to Mrs. Howell that the rolls at his own breakfast had seemed smaller than usual. "Cook's been setting aside the top of the batch for Miss Ashby and Lily," Mrs. Howell said, in the tone of someone reporting a perfectly natural development. "Miss Ashby and Lily have the same kitchen as the rest of the household," Richard said. "Yes, Your Grace, Cook is aware of that," a pause that contained a great deal. "She wanted to do it." Richard looked at his housekeeper. Mrs. Howell looked back at him with the expression she had been perfecting for 15 years, the one that was entirely respectful and entirely immovable simultaneously. "Fine," he said. He reviewed the schoolroom reports that evening. Lily's reading was progressing. Her arithmetic was, according to Miss Ashby's notes, improving steadily, though she finds it less engaging than history, which she approaches with genuine curiosity and should be encouraged in. There was a recommended list of history books, annotated with brief notes on why each might appeal specifically to Lily, and a suggestion that a visit to the village museum might be arranged if His Grace approved. He approved it. He set the report aside. He did not think about the fact that this was the first time in 8 months that he had read a governess's weekly report, and found himself reading it a second time. The second week, Garrett left flowers outside the schoolroom. Richard discovered this because he happened to be walking past at the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on how one looked at it, and saw the old man setting them against the door with the focused care of someone engaged in important work. Garrett had been the groundskeeper at Thornfield since before Richard inherited the estate. He was 71 years old, had strong opinions about soil drainage, and had never, in Richard's memory, voluntarily interacted with any member of the household staff unless absolutely required to. "Garrett," Richard said. Garrett straightened. "Your Grace." "What are you doing?" Garrett looked at the flowers, then at Richard, then back at the flowers, as if the answer was self-evident and the question mildly bewildering. "Miss Ashby mentioned she liked dahlias," he said. "Last ones of the season." "I see," Richard said. "She asked me about the kitchen garden last week," Garrett continued, unprompted, which was itself remarkable. Knew what she was talking about. Not many do. He picked up his tools. "Good morning, Your Grace." He walked away, apparently satisfied that this had been a complete and adequate explanation. Richard stood in the corridor for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The third week, Lily laughed. He heard it from the bottom of the stairs. He had been on his way to his study mid-morning, the house quiet in the way it was usually quiet, a silence that had always seemed to him appropriate and now, he noticed for the first time, felt somewhat heavy. He had one hand on the newel post when the sound came from upstairs. High and sudden and entirely unguarded, the way children laugh when they forget to remember that they are unhappy. He stood very still. It happened again, and then he heard Miss Ashby's voice. He couldn't make out words, only the tone, warm and unhurried, and then Lily again, less explosive this time but sustained, the kind of laughter that settles into something rather than disappearing. Richard stood at the bottom of the stairs, for a moment that he did not measure. Then he went to his study and closed the door and sat at his desk and looked at the drainage reports without reading them for a considerable length of time. Lily had not laughed since her mother's funeral. He had told himself this was normal, that grief moved at its own pace, that a child who had lost her mother was entitled to her silence, and he was not going to be the sort of father who demanded that she perform recovery for his comfort. He had not, he realized, considered that someone else might manage what he had not. He did not know how he felt about this. He filed it with some effort under irrelevant and returned to the drainage reports. That evening, he requested Miss Ashby's second weekly report. It was, like the first, clear and precise, and somewhat more human in tone than any governess's report he had previously received. Lily's history reading was continuing well. She had asked, apparently, whether the women in history books had ever done anything that mattered, and Miss Ashby had spent an afternoon on this question specifically, which she noted had produced the most engaged and sustained conversation Lily and I have had so far, and a list of further questions she generated herself that I have enclosed separately. The list was on a second page, 12 questions in Lily's careful, slightly uneven handwriting. Why didn't they write it down themselves? If they were so important, why don't we know their names? Miss Ashby says some of them did write it down, but people lost it. Did they lose it on purpose? Richard read the list twice. Then he folded it carefully, more carefully than the matter required, and placed it in his desk drawer rather than the household files, which is where it logically belonged. He told himself this was not significant. The following morning, passing Mrs. Howell in the hallway, he asked, without entirely planning to, how Miss Ashby was settling in. Mrs. Howell stopped. She turned to look at him with an expression he couldn't quite classify. "Very well, Your Grace," she said. "Better than well." A pause. "Shall I tell her you asked?" "No," he said immediately. "That won't be necessary." Mrs. Howell nodded, but he was almost certain, walking away, that she was smiling. He chose not to investigate this. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." The whispers reached Thornfield on a Friday afternoon, which was, Richard thought afterward, entirely characteristic of bad news, arriving at the end of the week when one had neither the energy to deal with it properly nor the option of ignoring it until Monday. He was in the library when Henderson, his estate manager, came in with the particular expression of a man delivering information he would have preferred not to possess. "Your Grace," Henderson said, "I thought you should be aware there is some talk, in the village, and apparently in certain circles in London as well." Richard set down his pen. "Talk about what?" "About Miss Ashby." The name landed in the quiet of the library, with more weight than it should have. "Sit down," Richard said. "Tell me exactly what you've heard." The source, as best Henderson had been able to determine, was Lord Ashford. Not a man Richard knew well. They moved in overlapping circles without having much occasion for direct contact. Ashford was older, well-connected in the way that certain men of his generation were well-connected, which was to say through accumulated favors and long memories, rather than any particular merit. He had a large estate in the north and a reputation for being pleasant in public, and considerably less so in private. What Ashford was saying, through the particular channels by which such things were said, a word at a club, a remark at dinner, the gentle deployment of raised eyebrows, was this: that Miss Clara Ashby had left his household under circumstances that did not reflect well on her, that she had overstepped, that she had made herself rather too comfortable with the family, that one ought to ask, if one were considering employing her, exactly why she had left and why the departure had been so sudden. He said nothing specific. Men like Ashford rarely did. Specifics could be disputed. Implications simply floated. Richard listened to all of this without expression. "Is there anything more concrete?" he said when Henderson finished. "No, Your Grace, nothing stated directly." "I see." He picked up his pen again. "Thank you, Henderson, that will be all." Henderson left. Richard sat at his desk and looked at the page in front of him, which he had no intention of reading. Lord Ashford. He turned the name over, examined it from several angles. Then he did something he had not done in 3 weeks of Miss Ashby's employment. He thought about her carefully, deliberately, and with the specific intent of forming an opinion. What did he actually know? She was punctual. Her reports were excellent. His daughter had laughed for the first time in 8 months in her presence. His groundskeeper, who liked almost no one, left her flowers. His housekeeper of 15 years, whose judgment he trusted above most people's, had called her a breath of fresh air. Against this, a set of unspecified implications from a man he barely knew. He was not, Richard told himself, unduly influenced by implication. He would observe. He would draw his own conclusions. That was the rational approach, and he was a rational man. He was not, he told himself firmly, doing this for any other reason. He began, in a way he did not entirely acknowledge to himself, to pay attention. It was not surveillance. He rejected that word when it occurred to him. It was simply that he moved through his own house with slightly less deliberate inattention than usual. He noticed things he had previously filed away as irrelevant. He noticed that when the young footman Thomas dropped an entire tray of glassware in the front hallway, a disaster that would, under most circumstances, produce a considerable amount of blame and misery. Miss Ashby appeared from nowhere, helped collect the pieces, said something quietly to Thomas that made him go from white-faced panic to visible relief in approximately 30 seconds, and then was gone before Mrs. Howell arrived to assess the damage. When Mrs. Howell later asked Thomas what had happened, Thomas said only that it had been an accident and that everything was sorted. He did not mention Miss Ashby, but he caught Richard's eye across the hallway with an expression of someone keeping a good secret. He noticed that on wet afternoons, when outdoor exercise was impossible, the sound of activity from the schoolroom was not the dutiful silence of lessons, but something more varied: movement, occasional debate, once what appeared to be a dramatic reading that involved at least two distinct voices, one of them unmistakably Lily's, doing an accent of uncertain geographical origin with great commitment. He noticed that cook, who had strong opinions about her kitchen, and who admitted people into it on a basis that Richard had never fully understood but had learned not to question, allowed Miss Ashby to make tea there on Sunday afternoons. This was, Mrs. Howell had once mentioned years ago, an honor extended to approximately 4 people in the history of the household. He noticed all of these things. He filed them. He did not examine the filing too closely. The direct observation happened by accident. It was a Wednesday evening, past 8 o'clock, and Richard was returning from the East Wing where he had been reviewing some necessary repairs with his estate manager. His route back to his study took him past the corridor that led to the family rooms, past Lily's bedroom, specifically, where a strip of warm light showed under the closed door. He should have continued walking. He stopped. Through the door, indistinct but audible, was Miss Ashby's voice, reading. He couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm of it, the rise and fall of a story being given its proper shape by someone who understood that stories required that. Lily asked something. Miss Ashby answered. There was a pause, and then Miss Ashby said something that made Lily make a small sound that was almost a laugh but softer, the kind of sound children make when they are comfortable enough not to bother performing their emotions. Then Lily's voice, clear and sudden in the quiet corridor. Miss Ashby, does my father know we're happy here? Richard's hand was on the wall beside him. He was not aware of having put it there. Miss Ashby was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice was careful and very kind. I think, she said, that your father wants very much for you to be happy here. Sometimes people who want something very much find it difficult to see when they've got it. It doesn't mean they don't want it. Another pause. Do you think he'll notice eventually? Lily asked. Yes, Miss Ashby said, with a certainty that Richard found inexplicably difficult to breathe around. I think he will. He stood in the corridor for considerably longer than he had any practical reason to. Then he walked to his study, sat down, and did not open a single document for the remainder of the evening. He called Miss Ashby to his study the following morning. She arrived promptly. She was always prompt, and sat in the chair across from his desk with her hands in her lap and the expression of someone prepared for a range of possible conversations and intending to be equal to whichever one arrived. He studied her for a moment. I am going to ask you something directly, he said, and I would like a direct answer. Of course, Your Grace. Lord Ashford, your previous employer. He watched her face. There are things being said. I want to know what happened. Something moved through her expression. He caught it this time because he was looking for it. Not guilt, not fear exactly. Something older and more tired than either. I left Lord Ashford's employment, she said carefully, because his eldest son made it impossible for me to remain. Richard waited. He was persistent, Miss Ashby said. In his attentions, I made my position clear on several occasions. He did not adjust his behavior. When I brought the matter to Lord Ashford's attention, he suggested that I had perhaps encouraged the situation without meaning to, and that it would be best for everyone if I found another position. A pause. I did not encourage it. But I found another position, because the alternative was remaining in a household where I was not safe, and where the person responsible had his father's protection. The room was very quiet. "And the things Ashford is saying now," Richard said. His voice was even, considerably more even than he felt. "The implication that you overstepped." "Is Lord Ashford's version of events," Miss Ashby said. "Yes." She met his gaze. "I can't stop him saying it. I can only tell you what actually happened and allow you to decide what you believe." She said this without appeal, without performance. The way a person speaks when they have told a true thing and have learned that truth is sometimes not enough and have decided to offer it anyway. Richard looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. "That will be all." She rose, nodded, and left. Richard turned to his window and looked out at the grounds, at the garden where Garrett's last dahlias were finished for the season, at the path Lily had started using again on her afternoon walks, at the house that had been quiet for 2 years and was, he realized, no longer quite so quiet. Lord Ashford had a son. Richard thought about this with a cold and focused attention that had very little to do with drainage reports. Then he sat down and wrote 2 letters, one to his London solicitor, and one to a man he knew who knew everything about everyone and was discreet about most of it. He sealed both letters and rang for Henderson. "Post these today," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." Henderson took the letters, paused. "And Miss Ashby, Your Grace, is she?" "Miss Ashby's position is not under discussion," Richard said. "She stays." Henderson's face did something that Richard chose not to examine. "Very good, Your Grace," Henderson said and left. That afternoon Richard walked past the schoolroom. He did not stop. He did not have any reason to stop. Through the closed door he could hear Lily's voice, asking something about queens, a specific queen, some historical particularity he couldn't catch. And then Miss Ashby's voice, answering with the unhurried attention of someone for whom no question was too small to take seriously. He stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, then he walked on. But he was, for the first time in a considerable while, not thinking about drainage reports at all. The letters came back within a week. Richard's solicitor wrote in the measured, careful language of a man who had learned to deliver unpleasant information without inflection. The man who knew everything about everyone wrote in considerably more direct terms. Richard read both letters twice. Then he sat very still for a moment in the way he did when something required him to recalibrate, not dramatically, not with visible disturbance, but with the quiet internal adjustment of a man who has discovered that the map he has been using is wrong and must now decide what to do about it. Lord Ashford's son, Edward, had done this before. Not once, 3 times, 3 women in 5 years, a governess, a lady's companion, and a young woman from the village who had been employed seasonally on the estate. In each case the pattern had been the same. In each case Lord Ashford had managed the situation in the same way, quietly, efficiently, and entirely to his son's advantage. Money had changed hands in at least 2 of the cases. Reputations had been carefully adjusted. The women had disappeared into other positions, or other counties, or other silences. And in each case, Lord Ashford had ensured that the version of events that circulated in polite society reflected poorly on the woman and not at all on his son. Clara Ashby was the 4th. Richard set the letters down on his desk. He thought about her sitting across from him in the chair, hands in her lap, telling him the truth without asking him to believe it, telling him what had happened with no performance of injury and no expectation of rescue, offering the facts and stepping back. He thought about how many times she must have told that truth, or versions of it, before arriving at Thornfield, and how many times it had not been enough. He picked up his pen. It was Mrs. Howell who came to him, which he had not expected. She knocked on his study door on a Thursday morning, knocked properly, waited to be admitted, entered with her hands folded, and her expression set in the particular configuration she used when she had decided that something needed to be said and had already accepted the consequences of saying it. Richard looked up from his desk. Mrs. Howell. Your Grace, she remained standing. I apologize for the interruption. I wanted to speak with you about Miss Ashby. Sit down. She sat, which told him this was serious. Mrs. Howell only sat when invited and only accepted when the matter warranted it. I heard something this morning, she said. From the village. Apparently Lord Ashford has been more direct in recent days. There are people saying, she paused, choosing words carefully. There are people saying that Miss Ashby's continued presence at Thornfield reflects poorly on your Grace's judgment, that a man of your position shouldn't need to be told what sort of woman. She stopped again. I won't repeat the precise wording. Richard's pen was in his hand. He set it down. And Miss Ashby, he said, does she know? I believe she does, Your Grace. One of the kitchen girls heard it in the village yesterday, and Mrs. Howell's composure shifted, almost imperceptibly. She didn't say anything to me directly, but I saw her face when she came in. Richard was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Howell, he said, in 15 years have I ever asked for your personal opinion on a household matter? Mrs. Howell considered this with appropriate seriousness. No, Your Grace. I'm asking now. She looked at him steadily. The expression on her face was one he had seen before, but never directed at him quite so plainly. Your Grace, she said, this house has had staff come and go for as long as I've been in it. Good people, some of them, competent people. But in 15 years I have not seen a single person walk through that door and make this household, make this family. She paused. Lily smiled at breakfast this morning. She asked if she could help cook with something this afternoon. She told me, and I am quoting precisely, Your Grace, because I want you to have the exact words. She told me that Miss Ashby makes her feel like the world is interesting again. The study was very quiet. I have been in service for 30 years, Mrs. Howell continued. I know the difference between a good employee and someone who is something else. Someone who simply, she seemed to search for the word and then, finding it, use it simply. Someone who is good. She folded her hands in her lap. Lord Ashford is not a man who deserves to win this. Richard looked at his housekeeper for a long moment. No, he said, he isn't. Mrs. Howell nodded once. She rose. She was almost at the door when he spoke again. Mrs. Howell, she turned. You said she didn't say anything to you directly. A pause. What did she say? Mrs. Howell's expression did something he couldn't quite name. She said that she hoped it wouldn't cause trouble for the household, and that if it would be easier for everyone, she was prepared to. She stopped. To leave, Richard said. Yes, Your Grace. He was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. Find Miss Ashby, he said. Ask her to come to the study, please. She knocked 10 minutes later. She came in the way she always came in, directly, without hesitation, with that quality she had of being entirely present in a room without demanding anything from it. But he could see it now, because he was looking, the slight set of her shoulders, the careful arrangement of her expression, the way a person looks when they have decided to be composed and are succeeding at some cost. Your Grace, she said. Sit down, Miss Ashby. She sat. He looked at her across the desk. She met his gaze with the directness he had noticed from the very first evening, in the corridor, biscuit in hand, Lily beside her, saying it won't happen again without apology or performance. You are going to leave, he said. She didn't deny it. I thought it might be simpler. For whom? For the household, for Lily, a pause, for you. And if I told you that your leaving would not be simpler for any of those parties? Something moved in her face, small, quickly controlled. I would want to know, she said carefully, what you intended to do instead. Richard set both hands flat on the desk. Lord Ashford is going to receive a letter from my solicitor this week outlining what I know about his son's conduct toward you, and toward 3 other women over the past 5 years. He is also going to be informed that I intend to share this information with several of his most prominent associates unless he retracts, publicly, every implication he has made about your character." He paused. "Additionally, I have spoken with 2 of the other women, or rather, my man in London has, and one of them is prepared, if supported, to pursue the matter formally. I have offered that support." Clara Ashby was very still. She stopped, started again. "You investigated?" "Yes." "When?" "The day after you told me what happened." She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not gratitude, exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated. Something that looked, he thought, like the face of a person who has been braced for a long time and has just been told they can put it down. "He'll fight it," she said. Her voice was steady. "Men like Ashford always fight it. He'll say she stopped. "Being associated with this publicly with me will cost you. People will say you're only doing it because she didn't finish." "I know what they'll say," Richard said. "And?" He looked at her steadily. "I find I care rather less about what people say than I did 3 weeks ago." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said quietly, genuinely asking. It was, Richard thought, an entirely fair question. She had not asked him to fight for her. She had not, at any point, asked him for anything at all. She had offered facts and stepped back, exactly as she had said, and had been prepared, was still prepared, to disappear quietly in order to spare him difficulty. He had been sitting in this house for 2 years in a particular kind of stillness that he had told himself was appropriate, orderly, sufficient. He looked at the woman across from him who had walked into his household and without trying, without performing, without asking permission, made his daughter interested in the world again, who had made old Garrett leave flowers, who had made Cook give up the best roles, who had told a child in the dark that her father wanted to see her happy, even if he hadn't managed to show it yet. He thought about standing at the bottom of the stairs, listening to laughter. "Because," he said, "I have recently been made aware that I have been looking at something for 3 weeks without seeing it, and I have no intention of making that mistake any further." Clara was very still. "Miss Ashby," he said, and then, because he had spent 3 weeks not saying things he could have said, "Clara," she looked up. "Stay," he said, "not because of Lily, not because of the household." He held her gaze, "because I am asking you to." The room was quiet. Outside, distantly, he could hear Lily in the garden, her voice carrying in the cold autumn air, talking to Garrett about something with the animated persistence she had apparently rediscovered. Garrett's responses were, as always, minimal, but he was responding. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You should know," she said finally, "that I am not easy to employ. I have opinions about history and roses and the correct way to make tea. I ask questions you may find inconvenient. I will always tell Lily the truth, even when a comfortable lie would be simpler." A pause. "I am told I am rather too much by people who prefer their households quiet." "My household," Richard said, "has been quiet for 2 years. I find I have had enough of it." Something happened to Clara Ashby's face. Not the careful arrangement, not the composed expression she had been maintaining at some cost. Something underneath it, warm and real and entirely unguarded, the way Lily laughed when she forgot to remember she was unhappy. "Then I'll stay," she said. The letter went to Ashford on Friday. The response came back within a week, through solicitors, carefully worded, the retraction dressed up in language that made it sound almost voluntary. It wasn't. It was the response of a man who had looked at the evidence assembled against him and calculated correctly that fighting it would cost considerably more than conceding. His son was quietly removed from public life for an extended period. The woman in London who had agreed to pursue the matter formally did so, with full support, and won. Richard did not discuss any of this with Clara directly. She read about the London case in the newspaper one morning at breakfast. He saw the moment she recognized the name, and she set the paper down and was quiet for a moment and then looked up and found him watching her from across the table. She said nothing. He said nothing. But something passed between them across the breakfast table that required no words at all, and afterward Lily looked between them with the bright, alert expression of a child who has noticed something and is pretending not to. That evening Richard passed the schoolroom and for the first time knocked. "Come in," Clara said. He opened the door. The room was warm, a fire going, books spread across the table, Lily sitting cross-legged on the window seat with a volume almost too large for her lap. She looked up when he entered with the expression he had been learning to look for. Open, unguarded, the face she wore when she had forgotten to be careful. "Papa," she said, "Miss Ashby says Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine went on a crusade." "She did," Richard said. "Did you know that?" "I did." Lily considered him with the grave assessment of an 8-year-old, who is not yet fully convinced that adults know as much as they claim. "Miss Ashby knew more about it than you probably do," she said, with confidence. "Almost certainly," he agreed. He looked at Clara across the room. She was sitting at the table with a book open in front of her, and an expression she was not entirely managing to keep neutral. "I thought," Richard said, "that we might all take dinner together this evening, if Miss Ashby has no objection." Clara looked at him. "No objection," she said carefully. "Good," he looked at Lily. 5 minutes. He pulled the door closed behind him and stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to Lily immediately begin telling Clara everything she knew about Eleanor of Aquitaine at considerable speed, and Clara responding with the unhurried, genuine attention that she brought to everything. He stood there in his own house, in the quiet corridor, and felt something he had filed under irrelevant for 2 years shift quietly and irrevocably into a different category. Then he went downstairs to tell Cook to set an extra place. Cook's reaction, he noted, was disproportionate for the occasion. He found he didn't mind at all. Mrs. Howell had a theory. She had developed it in her first week of observing Miss Ashby, Clara as she thought of her now, though she was careful about when she used the name aloud, and she had never seen any reason to revise it. The theory was simple. Some people walked into a house and filled it. Not loudly, not deliberately. They simply had a quality that expanded into available space, the way warmth did, gradually and without announcement, until one day you noticed that rooms which had been cold for years were no longer cold, and you couldn't say exactly when the change had occurred. She had watched it happen to the kitchen first, then the groundskeeper, then the upstairs staff, then Lily. Then, finally, slowly, resistantly, in the manner of a man who had decided some time ago that certain things were not available to him, and was having considerable difficulty revising that decision, the Duke himself. Mrs. Howell considered this a personal victory, though she was too professional to say so. She said it to Cook instead, on a Tuesday morning in November, while the house was quiet and the kettle was on, and Cook was doing the thing she always did when she was pleased about something, which was to make considerably more food than the occasion required. "I knew," Mrs. Howell said, "from the first week." Earlier, Cook said, without looking up from the pastry she was rolling. "First day, she came into my kitchen and asked if she could make tea and said please and thank you and washed her own cup afterward." She pressed the rolling pin down with emphasis. "First day." His grace took somewhat longer. "Men always do." Mrs. Howell conceded this with a nod. To be fair to him, he came around. Eventually, he fought Ashford. Cook's rolling pin paused. This was, they both understood, the thing that could not be dismissed. A man could be won over by good management and obvious results. A man who dismantled another man's carefully constructed lie and stood in a public forum and said this woman is telling the truth, and I will spend whatever is necessary to prove it. That was a different quality of coming around entirely. Yes, Cook said, he did. They were quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way of women who have worked alongside each other long enough that silence, is its own form of conversation. From somewhere above them came the sound of footsteps, Lily's, identifiable by their particular rhythm, quick and uneven, the gait of a child going somewhere with purpose. Then her voice, calling something. Then, a moment later, Clara's voice answering from further away, the words indistinct but the tone clear. Then Lily laughing. Cook and Mrs. Howell looked at each other. "I'll make extra for breakfast," Cook said, turning back to her pastry. "You always do," Mrs. Howell said. The morning was bright and very cold, the kind of November day that offered no warmth but a great deal of light, everything sharp-edged and clean, the grounds frost-white, the sky a pale and specific blue. Clara was in the rose garden. She was there most mornings when weather permitted, which Garrett had initially observed with the suspicious attention of a man protective of his territory, and had eventually accepted with the resigned satisfaction of someone who has discovered that another person shares his standards. They had reached an arrangement over the summer, wordless, practical, the kind that develops between people who communicate better through action than speech. He handled the structure. She handled what he called, with Garrett economy, the fussing. The roses this autumn had been the best in 20 years. Garrett had mentioned this to no one except Mrs. Howell, and only because she had asked directly. Clara was kneeling at the far end of the bed, doing something precise with the late growth, when she heard the gate. She did not look up immediately. She had learned the rhythm of this, the particular sound of that gate, the particular footstep on the frost-hard path. "You're out early," she said. "I have a meeting in the village at 10, Richard said. "I wanted to walk before it." "In the rose garden." "The rose garden is on the way." She looked up at him. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, looking down at her with the expression she had spent a year learning, the one that appeared composed and wasn't quite, the one that had been there, she thought, longer than either of them had acknowledged, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. "Garrett says the east bed needs restructuring in spring," she said. "Garrett says many things. He says this one to me directly, which means he's decided I'm allowed to have an opinion about it. High praise. Unprecedented, I'm told." Richard crouched down beside her, not something she had expected, not something the Duke of Merston did ordinarily, kneeling in frost-covered gardens, and looked at the bed with the focused attention he brought to everything he had decided mattered. "The east bed has always been difficult," he said. "The drainage is wrong." Garrett said the same thing. Garrett is usually right about drainage. They were quiet for a moment, side by side in the cold garden, the house behind them, the ground spreading frost-white in every direction. "Lily asked me something last night," Clara said. "What did she ask?" "She asked whether governesses ever stop being governesses." A pause. She asked it very carefully, the way she asks things when she already knows the answer she wants and is trying not to want it too much. Richard was quiet beside her. "She is not the only one who has wondered," he said. Clara set down her shears. She looked at her hands for a moment, soil-dark at the fingernails, cold-reddened at the knuckles, entirely unfit for a conversation of any significance. This was, she thought, completely characteristic of how things happened between them, not at dinner tables or in drawing rooms but in corridors and gardens and breakfast rooms, in the unremarkable moments of an ordinary day, which were the only moments either of them entirely trusted. "Richard," she said, he looked at her. "You should know," she said, "that I come with opinions about roses and history and the correct temperature at which tea becomes undrinkable. I will always tell Lily the truth even when it's inconvenient. I ask questions you may find presumptuous. I have been told on more than one occasion that I am." "Too much," he said. "Yes, you mentioned this once before." "I meant it." "I know." He looked at her steadily. The gray eyes, which she had spent a year learning to read, were not trying to hide anything at all. "I find, Clara, that after 2 years of not nearly enough, too much is precisely what I was looking for." She looked at him for a long moment. The frost on the grass, the pale blue sky, Somewhere inside the house, Lily's voice asking something of someone, loud and unguarded and entirely at home. "Then ask me properly," Clara said, "if you're going to ask." Something moved through his face, relief, and something warmer, and underneath both of those a look she recognized now, had recognized for months, had been careful not to name until she was certain he knew what he was doing with it. He asked her properly. She said yes. Later that morning, when Richard had gone to his village meeting and Lily was at her lessons, and the house had settled into its particular mid-morning quiet, Mrs. Howell came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. Cook looked up. Mrs. Howell said nothing, but she was smiling in a way that Cook had not seen since the Christmas before last. Cook put the kettle on. "Well," Cook said. She said yes, Mrs. Howell said. Cook set down the kettle. She pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table. She looked at the ceiling for a moment in the manner of someone receiving news they have been expecting for a considerable time and finding, despite this, that it still produced a feeling. "I'll make a cake," she said. "It's 10:30 in the morning." "I'll make a cake," Cook repeated with finality. Mrs. Howell considered objecting. She decided against it. "Make it the good one," she said, "with the almonds." Cook was already reaching for the flour. That afternoon, in the schoolroom, Lily put down her history book and looked at Clara with the expression of someone who has been waiting patiently for information they consider overdue. "Well," she said. Clara looked at her. "Well, what?" Lily gave her the look, the one she had inherited entirely from her father, the one that said, "I am being very patient, but I want you to know that I see exactly what is happening." "Lily," Clara said. "I heard the gate this morning," Lily said, with dignity. "And then you came in for breakfast and you were doing the thing where you're trying not to smile." "I do not have a thing where I'm trying not to smile." "You have had it for months," Lily said, with the calm authority of someone stating a well-established fact. "Mrs. Howell has it too, and Cook. Garrett doesn't make faces, but he's been whistling since September." Clara looked at this child, 8 years old, bright-eyed, entirely sure of herself in a way she had not been a year ago, and felt something that had been building quietly for 12 months settle into place, with the certainty of a thing that was always going to happen, and had simply been waiting for everyone to catch up. "Yes," she said. Lily looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Yes," Clara said. Lily was quiet for approximately 3 seconds, which was, Clara suspected, the longest she had ever been quiet voluntarily. Then she picked up her history book, opened it to her page, and said, with enormous composure, "I think we should do something special for dinner." "I think Cook is already ahead of you," Clara said. "Good," Lily said. "She makes better cakes when she's happy." She looked up. "We're all happy, in case you didn't notice." "I noticed," Clara said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and returned to her book. Outside in the garden, the last of the autumn roses held on in the cold, clear light, tended, finally, the way they had always deserved to be. Mrs. Howell, when asked years later what she had known and when, always said the same thing. From the first week, the house knew before any of them did. She was, as usual, entirely correct. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.